Is it really that simple? Over the past few weeks, we were talking about how this black diagonal resistance is going to be rejecting price all the way into the halving event, just like it did in the past. So we're going to be talking about that in a lot more detail in today's video, as well as the 4-year cycle, as well as the pre-halving tendencies. So let's dive right into it. Subscribe to the channel for more videos like this in the future, and let's talk about this black macro diagonal resistance. This is always a resistance in the pre-halving period. So these blue vertical lines are the halving event, and we always see rejection from this black macro diagonal resistance, which is always at an 8-degree angle across time. You can see that as well. But even in 2019, even if we upside wicked beyond this resistance, we continuously rejected from here time and time again in the pre-halving period. But this of course changes in the post-halving period, because we then see that last rejection immediately after the halving, just like we see here as well. The last orange circle immediately after the halving. And then we see a black circle, which is a successful retest of what was once upon a time an old resistance turn into a new support right over here. And you can see this in the retest post 2020 as well. Last rejection and then retest of this black macro diagonal resistance as a new support, and then we see springboarding to new all-time highs. After that retest attempt is successful, and you can see that this springboarding to new all-time highs occurs approximately 200 days after the halving event. This tends to occur and repeat across cycles where we see this breaking to new all-time highs after the halving event, 200 days approximately. So this retest is really important in facilitating that upside into the parabolic stage of this bull run. So going into the halving event, and we have to talk about how few months remain in going into that event, because we have approximately 100 days left. And during this 100 days, we see a pre-halving rally occur 60 days before the halving event. And we also have that 1 month, 40-day period. So 30 to 35, 40-day period where a deeper retrace could occur. And we've seen this in the past. I spoke about this in yesterday's video, so feel free to check out that one. But we're running out of time when it comes to pre-halving retrace. So if we talk about this period here, we only have 100 days left. And so far, this resistance has been a very pivotal one, because even if we focus on the 4-year cycle, this being candle 1, 2, 3, and 4, candle 1, 2, 3, and 4, candle 1, 2, 3, and now 4, in every candle 4, we break the 3-year 4-year cycle resistance. So each 4-year cycle has a 3-year resistance, which rejects price in candle 1, 2, and 3. And then in the 4th year, the final year of the 4-year cycle, we break beyond this resistance. And this has been the case time and again. Candle 1, 2, 3, and 4. This was a 3-year resistance. In this candle 3, we never really quite touched this resistance, but we broke beyond it in that candle 4. We're in candle 4 once again, and you can see how for 3 years, this 46k region has been rejecting price for 3 years straight, even in 2023, rejecting at 46k, and this year we're finally going to break that resistance. So when I mentioned that 46k was going to be the top in 2023, that was very much the case, and that was very true, because that was a 4-year cycle resistance. We tend to historically see rejection from that 4-year cycle resistance in a pre-halving year, just like in 2019 and also just like in 2023. But candle 4 is going to change this. We're going to break beyond the 4-year cycle resistance this year. The only question is, does that occur before the halving, or does that occur after the halving? And it's this chart that suggests to us that it will probably occur after the halving. Going into the halving event, we could still see upside wicks beyond this macro trendline resistance. Upside wicks, FOMO wicks in that final hype going into the ETF catalyst, we could still see some upside beyond here. But history is suggesting to us that we're going to simply reject into a pre-halving retrace. And this is where this chart comes in. Are we going to see a deeper retrace in this next 40-day period? Or are we going to see that retrace around the halving event? Because we see a pre-halving retrace around the halving event, but we also sometimes see deeper retracements a few months before the halving event. And it's a very small box now. This is a narrowing amount of time where a deeper retrace could take place, because if we don't retrace during this period, then the only last buy the dip opportunity we're going to have is in this pre-halving retrace around the halving event. So going back here, in the next 100 days, if we see any pullbacking in price, any pullback, any dipping, any retracement or correction, any downside going into the halving event, that will be one of the very final buy the dip opportunities, one of those final bargain buying opportunities before we launch into a parabolic trend continuation. You can see here, prior to 2016 halving, rejection into that pre-halving retrace, and then we curl back up and rally to new all-time highs. In 2019, consistent rejection from this trend line before finally breaking into a new uptrend after the halving event. So could we see some consistent rejection at these highs, upside wicking, going into the halving event, pre-halving retrace around the halving event of around 20%, as we saw in 2020, or 2016 is when we saw a 40% retrace. How deep will that retrace really be? It's difficult to say, but what if this is the diagonal that can't be breached in the coming months going into the halving? If we just continue to maintain these highs, maybe even pull back a bit going into the halving, and then see that pre-halving retrace after the halving event, we'll be able to break above this trend line, turn it into a support, and then rally to new all-time highs like we've seen in the past. And it's interesting because this diagonal is around 45k, 45,500, but this is a dynamic trend line resistance which is declining over time. And 200 days after the halving is when this trend line is going to be representing the price point of 41k. So you can see how just a few months after the halving, this trend line is going to be a little bit easier to break beyond, simply because it's going to represent a lower price compared to the price point it's representing today. So for the time being, history is suggesting we're going to hover around these price levels, maybe upside wick beyond them, but ultimately this is going to precede a rejection going into the halving event for a pre-halving retrace that we tend to see around the halving event. And it's going to be one of those last buy the dip opportunities, because simply we see breaking out in the candle fall to new all-time highs, breaking out to new highs in this cycle. For instance, if we focus on this downside wick here in a candle 4, that's also a factor. And what if that's going to be that pre-halving retrace? This downside wicking that we see in a candle 4, that tends to occur early on in the candle 4. So this is now the candle 4 for Bitcoin. Downside wicking earlier on in the year is a possibility. We've seen it many times in the past. Of course, sample size of 2, but this is all we have to work with. So a downside wick earlier on in this year, that would be very much in line with history. Very much in line also with this chart, which is essentially suggesting to us that we're going to continue rejecting from this macro diagonal resistance going into the halving, and after the halving we're only going to be able to break beyond this trendline resistance and rally to new all-time highs. Of course, the ETF, will that shake things up quite considerably and change the course of history when it comes to these repeating price tendencies? Difficult to say for the time being. History is going as expected, and history is still simply following history. So let's see if that continues. That's about it for today's video update. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe to the channel for more videos like this in the future. Like this video if you enjoy content like this going forward, and I'll speak to you in the next one. Speak to you soon.